Did socialism ruin Sri Lanka? Was it a political problem? What was the actual root cause of all of this? At the very heart of all of these economic problems, there is one culprit that nobody really expected: rice. Okay, let me get back to that later on in the video. For now, I need to tell you a story. Post-independence Sri Lanka was actually in quite a unique position. We came out completely unscathed from World War II. Unlike countries like India and Pakistan, we didn't have to shed blood or fight wars for our independence. We were located very strategically in the Indian Ocean, so as to benefit from things like export and trade. After British colonial rule, we sort of inherited from them a very strong export sector, and also the surrounding logistics. We had relatively higher education levels relative to at least other Asian countries and other post-colonial countries. And our first Governor General, who was the sort of a president before presidents were a thing, after we gained independence, once claimed that Sri Lanka would be the best bet for Asia. So what went wrong? 1948. The picture-perfect Sri Lankan economy actually had a lot of nuances that were under the covers which aren't immediately visible. At least back then they weren't. So we were completely polarized politically between the sort of communist-oriented left and the conservative right. Trade unions, industrial strikes, but most importantly and most crucially for this whole story, deep ethnic tensions existed in Sri Lanka, and they were quite dormant immediately after independence, but they escalated, and that's what caused a lot of problems historically for Sri Lankan growth, and we'll get into all of this in the video. So what happened to the best bet for Asia? In 1960, Sri Lanka's gross national product, also known as GNP per capita, was around $141, higher than Thailand, which was about 96, Indonesia around 51, and about the same as that of Korea, which was around $156, and only 50% lower than Malaysia, which was around $273 at the time. By 1995, the picture looks completely different. Sri Lanka's per capita income had risen to only $700, compared with $9,700 for South Korea, $3,890 for Malaysia, $2,740 for Thailand, and $980 for Indonesia, all as per World Bank data. So was Sri Lanka a communist country? Absolutely not. By 1931, we had sort of our voting rights, and by independence, we were a fully functioning democracy. Sri Lanka is split into two main political parties, the centre-right UNP, United National Party, and the centre-left Freedom Party, the SLFP. Each ruling the country for around 30 years from the period of 1948 to 1998. So I've spoken a lot about what happened to Sri Lanka in more recent times with regards to the debt crisis. But in gaining this sort of historical perspective, I want to focus specifically on this post-independence era to, say, the early 2000s. So it's quite useful to break this down into two main time periods. So 1948 to 1977, that's the first block. And then 1977 to around 1998 is the second block. And these periods are broken down in this way because the actual dynamics of what happened in the economy and what happened politically are quite different. So if you look at the period from 1948 to 1977, it's actually also useful to break this down further into 1948 to 1960 and 1960 to 1977. Post-colonialism, we actually inherited from the British a very strong and prosperous export sector, mainly to do with plantations, tea, coconut, rubber, and things like that, which at the time accounted for around 90% of our exports and our foreign exchange. We used most of this money to fund imports of food and essential sort of food items. And what we did was we taxed our plantation exports in order to fund things like welfare. And primarily, and at the very core of all of this, is this subsidy on rice. So a subsidy is essentially some kind of assistance, some kind of payment made by the government to, in this case, rice production, to effectively reduce the cost of rice and make it cheaper for people. And rice in Sri Lanka was virtually free. The subsidy was supporting very low prices for rice. So what this meant was that things like the subsidy on rice were directly dependent on how our exports of tea, rubber, coconut were actually doing, because we were taxing that to gain revenue to in turn subsidize the rice production. So what happened was that when market prices globally for rice started falling, our terms of trade started weakening, and we could no longer support these programs. So instead of actually cutting expenditure, what the government actually did was controlling imports. It's quite similar to what we're doing right now, trying to control imports as a way of amending certain imbalances in the economy. But overall, it is a short-term policy, and it lacks a bit of long-term perspective. And the issue here with sort of controlling imports and closing the economy out to external competition, and not actually fixing your sort of fiscal imbalances and the fact that you're overspending, the problem with this is that it has unintended consequences. And in economics, this concept of unintended consequences is essentially this idea that you implement a policy or you do something with a certain intent, but it creates sort of externalities and it creates problems which weren't really intended, unintended consequences. And in this case, it made our entire export sector less competitive. So in controlling imports, we actually sheltered our industries and agriculture, and we were unable to diversify our export base. And this was sort of a fundamental long-term problem that was a result of literally just trying to maintain this rice subsidy. Looking at this from a wider perspective, it's actually more important to look at what we didn't do than what we did at the time. What we didn't do was we didn't invest our export earnings into supporting industry and diversifying our export base. Instead, we spent it on things like welfare. And Sri Lanka has a lot of good welfare systems that are in place, so free education, free healthcare. At the time, things like subsidies on essentials. But the consequence that spending on things like this has is that it takes away from the money that you could have used to invest in industry, in things that could make your country more competitive over the long term. And things like education, it's an exception to this because you're kind of investing in the human capital of a country. But things like that rice subsidy, and we'll see it as we go on in the story, were a waste of resources. So this means that there's a lack of investment in industry and in agriculture. Our terms of trade decline if world prices for things like tea, rubber, coconut fall. Our export revenues fall. We become less internationally competitive because we haven't invested and we haven't innovated. And this cycle goes on and on and on, and it leads to a sort of foreign currency deficit. And we've had that problem in the past, and this is why, and we have it today. And there are some parallels between what's happening today and what has happened in the past in Sri Lanka, and they do say history repeats itself. The period from 1961 to 1977 is really unique because it's a period of sort of macroeconomic experimentation. We introduced trade restrictions to avoid a foreign currency crisis during 1961 to 1964. We partially opened up the economy in 1965 to 1970, and we reintroduced restrictions from 1970 to 1977 because the government saw that when we liberalized, we spent most of our sort of foreign earnings on consumption, on essentially importing things, and we were kind of wasting our foreign exchange. So it's funny, at the time the ILO, the International Labour Association, released a statement that Sri Lanka was actually the only country other than Burma, which I believe is Myanmar, that earned less foreign currency in 1968 than it did in 1958. So during this period of like 1970 to 1977, to control foreign exchange outflows, which the government believed was due to sort of private sector outflows, the government had this idea to nationalize everything. So to pretty much buy different sort of sectors and firms and take control of things like tea plantations to the control of the government. And this was a bad idea because we didn't look after it. The government ended up not marketing the tea properly. They ended up not innovating in terms of increasing the yield per hectare, per acre, and our quality and our competitiveness in these industries fell over time. And over this whole period, the UNP, the SLFP, they would come into power in cycles every 5 years. With an election cycle, one would come into power and then the next would come, and then they would undo the progress of the previous one. So we never had a clear vision on what our stance on our key export sector was. Was it tea? Was it coconut? Was it rubber? We never had a stance on welfare. We were always, because of the polarizing nature of the two parties, where one is sort of more conservative and one is more sort of leaning communist oriented, because of the polarizing nature of the two parties and because of this sort of zigzag nature of the political system, we never actually had a real vision of what we wanted to do with the country, and this caused a lot of problems. Fundamentally, the most important thing that actually dragged us down in this period is the idea that we could have funded all of our welfare expenditure by just taxing our exports on this very specific export, which is just plantation, which is dependent on world market prices, right? So this is actually quite brilliantly summarized by Sir Ivor Jennings, who was the Vice Chancellor of the University of Ceylon at the time. So he said that if through some catastrophe the tea industry was wiped out, 1/3 of national income would disappear. It is a dangerous form of economy because it places the welfare of the country under the control of forces which neither the people nor the government of the island can influence. So at the heart of all of this, at the heart of Sri Lanka's entire economic approach, there was one culprit: rice. So after independence, we were quite happy to subsidize rice. The electorate loved it, and this was a really popular policy. But in 1953, around that time, this policy of subsidizing rice became unaffordable. And when the government made a move to take away the subsidy, public protest erupted, and the Prime Minister, to an extent that the Prime Minister at the time actually had to resign. These chains of events were a demonstration of just how appealing social welfare measures like the rice subsidy are to the public of Sri Lanka. The Sri Lankan public considered things like basic foodstuff at a virtually free price, like rice, free healthcare, free education. They considered these things that the government was spending on their inalienable rights. And all throughout Sri Lankan history, welfare politics have been sort of center stage. Politicians got the impression that the way to win was to pander to the public's short-term vision and not have a long-term plan. That was not being appreciated. So year after year after year, politicians came into power essentially with promises of handouts and promises of a better life. The timeline is pretty standard across time. You make these promises of things like, for example, increasing the rice subsidy. You get elected, and then you realize that it's not sensible when you look at the budget deficit that the government is currently running and how unsustainable the financial position of the country is. So it's not possible to increase the rice subsidy. So you do nothing, and then a few months before the next election, you give out some other handout in an attempt to win power again. And throughout Sri Lanka's history, the two parties have been shuffling this around, and that's kind of what happened. So what I find the most interesting about this whole story is that if we just didn't spend on this rice subsidy at the time, we would have been able to invest this money into our industries, and this would have sort of made us more competitive. We would have accelerated in growth, and we would have actually kept up with those other East Asian countries post-colonialism. Moving on to the next time period, the 1977 to 1998 time period, it was clear to the public that a radical sort of transformation was necessary. These welfare, inward-looking policies clearly weren't working, growth was slowing, and things were getting worse and worse. The government began liberalizing the economy, opening up to foreign direct investment, FDI, and removing things like the food subsidy, despite huge opposition from parliamentarians and the public. So there were some sort of bold members of the finance ministry at the time that pushed ahead with removing these things, public expenditure programs like the Mahaveli program at the time, to sort of revive ancient glories in the country. So all of this led to FDI pouring into the country, our export sector, specifically in garments, picking up, and tourism starting to increase. What's quite remarkable is that during sort of the post-colonial era, the whole of sort of the 20th century, this period from 1977 to 1982 was the only 5-year period which had sort of an average growth rate of over 6%. It never happened again. At the time, it was very clear that Sri Lanka will catch up with the other East Asian countries, despite, the mismanagement that's happened in the past. With a growth rate like this, with good liberalization, with growing export industries, we were going to catch up. And there's a lesson to be learned in all of this, even today, when, we have this big foreign currency deficit in the country and we can't seem to attract inflows. What happened during this 5-year period, although it's such a small sample of 5 years, was one of the most prosperous times in Sri Lanka. And, at the time, our external position was improving. Remittances started flowing in to the country, tourism inflows, so more money into the country, a growing export sector with that sort of liberalization in garments again. Our foreign currency situation at the time as well also improved. Not just high growth, but we were also managing our sort of external budget. So what happened? Why is it that I can only pinpoint this 5-year period as a prosperous time in Sri Lanka? 1983, the year that ethnic tensions started rising again, shifting focus away from our liberalization, our growth policies, to managing an actual ethnic conflict. The war's effect on the Sri Lankan economy was significant, and it sort of began to reverse all of our progress. Due to the sort of strong welfare state that we had established, we had a free education, free healthcare, we had all these things that were set up, and as a result of this, we had a population that were educated and were able to contribute, but they found themselves with no jobs in an environment of low growth. And this led to sort of more protests, youth insurrections and things like that. And then there was the JVP rebellion that happened. It was conflict after conflict during this sort of war period that completely shifted the focus away from the policies that we had found were actually working for us. And after sort of this 5-year period, so when you look at 1982 and beyond, our growth takes a huge hit. Everything goes down the drain. As the war gets worse and worse and worse over the years, tourism starts slowing down, foreign investment stops coming in, and we go into the spiral in the towards the 1990s. It gets worse and worse, and the economy gets poorer and poorer, and foreign investment isn't coming in. Our debt gets worse and worse. We had finally started rebuilding our economy structurally, and we lose all our progress. I'm not going to go into the war in any level of detail at all, because everyone in the country really knows that that's what made us poor in the first place. We were on par with countries like Singapore. We were on par with other East Asian countries to grow, and we had finally figured out the policies that would have worked for us. And of course, everyone knows that the main culprit here is the war. But the war is now over. It ended in 2009. And what we are facing now is sort of a common enemy in all of these, the financial struggles of the country, the rise in inflation, the rise in debt levels. We're being squeezed. And so we now have a completely different economic situation. And my other videos go into plenty of depth as to how we got there and how we can attempt to fix it. The purpose of this video was to shed some light on the historical context as to how we got here. And this is a question that a lot of people have actually asked. Sure, we're in this situation of financial struggle and debt, but what was the sort of historical context to this whole story? And the really strange thing is that there's very little material on this out there, and so I thought it would be really beneficial to make this video so that a lot of people have access to this information. The majority of this this video and the research that I conducted for this video comes from the famous, one of the best economists the country has ever produced, Saman Kelagama. Reading through his research, I put some links in the description. He has a sort of concluding remark in one of his papers, which I'm going to read out now. Once referred to as the best bet in Asia, Sri Lanka could not live up to that promise. What eventually determined its destiny was governed by A, two extreme political ideologies trying to unsuccessfully overcome a foreign exchange crisis during 1948 to 1977, and B, conflict between two main communities, dormant during the immediate post-independence era and erupting after 1983 and becoming the Achilles heel of the growth process. So if you really boil down the entire historical context, what we see is two things, right? So the first is that political polarization between the left and the right led to no concrete vision for how the country wanted to progress. And this is a problem we face now as well. And so there are lessons to learn from history. And the second reason was the racial and the ethnic tensions that happened in the country. And that's also really relevant, not just for Sri Lanka, but the whole world as a whole. It was these things combined that led to the stagnation of the country. And we hear all these things. I remember a time when I was in school and my teachers would tell me that Sri Lanka and Singapore were on par, and the Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew at the time, who kind of revived Singapore, used to say that Sri Lanka is a great example. It was one of those quotes and one of those stories that really stuck by me, because we've seen how a country like Singapore can accelerate and have sort of a huge GDP per capita income per head, and how we've slowed down, not just relative to Singapore, but Indonesia, Malaysia, and all of these examples that we mentioned. The war is now over. It's a part of history now. What we can focus on now is ensuring that we have sort of a good long-term vision for how we want to implement policies in the country. And for more information on what the country is undergoing right now, that foreign debt crisis, I'll put some videos up here so you guys can revisit those videos. But I hope you guys enjoyed the historical context to the scenario. This was actually a really fun video for me to make, because I realized just how little information there is out there about this. And it makes me think that I'm really doing something that's worthwhile and that's worth my time. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.